Our story began when I married Mark, the love of my life. It was a magical day, surrounded by our loved ones in a small church in the town where we grew up. I remember every detail of that day as if it were yesterday. My white dress, Mark's smile as he saw me walk down the aisle, our mother's tears of happiness. After the ceremony, we celebrated with a simple reception in the garden of my parents' house. We danced, laughed, and toasted to our future together. A few months after the wedding, Mark proposed that we move to the family farm. His father, Javier, had been left alone after his wife passed away a couple of years ago, and Mark felt it was his duty to be near him to help him with the farm. At first, I felt a little unsure about this big change in our lives. I had grown up in the village and had never lived on a farm, but I knew how important it was to Mark, so I accepted with a smile. We packed up our belongings and said goodbye to our families and friends. The farm was a few hours away, so it was a long but exciting drive. Along the way, Mark told me stories of his childhood on the farm, how he helped his father with the animals and crops. I could see the passion and love he had for the place. When we arrived, Javier greeted us with a warm embrace. He was a tall, sturdy man with calloused hands from hard work on the farm. Despite the sadness in his eyes at the loss of his wife, he welcomed us with a genuine smile. He showed me the house where we would live, a charming wooden building with a wide porch overlooking the vast green fields. As we unpacked our things and settled into our new home, I couldn't help but feel a mixture of emotions. On the one hand, I was excited to begin this new adventure with Mark, but on the other hand, I felt a little out of place in these unfamiliar surroundings. However, I was determined to make it work, for Mark and for our family. What I didn't know at the time was that this move would mark the beginning of a series of events that would change my life forever, testing my marriage, my values, and everything I thought I knew about love and loyalty. The first few weeks on the farm were a period of adjustment for me. Accustomed to life in the village, I had to quickly learn to adjust to the pace and demands of farm life. Mark, on the other hand, seemed to be in his element. He got up early every morning, eager to start the day's work alongside his father. I, meanwhile, took care of the housework. I cooked, cleaned, and tried to make our house a cozy home. I also helped Javier with the garden, learning about the different vegetables and herbs we grew. Despite my initial hesitation, I slowly began to find a rhythm and enjoy the tranquility and beauty of our surroundings. With Mark spending more and more time in the fields, Javier and I began to spend more time together. At first, it was just small interactions, a good morning in the morning, a shared cup of coffee in the afternoon. But over time, our conversations became longer and more personal. Javier would tell me stories of his youth, how he had met Mark's mother, and how together they had built the farm from scratch. He spoke of her with so much love and nostalgia that I couldn't help but be moved. In return, I would tell him about my life in the village, my dreams and my hopes for the future with Mark. Without realizing it, I began to look forward to these moments with Javier. His presence became a comfort, especially on days when Mark was too busy to spend time with me. Javier always had a kind word, a joke to make me laugh or a shoulder to lean on. I remember one day in particular when Mark had to go into town to buy parts for the tractor. Javier and I spent the whole afternoon in the garden, picking vegetables and talking about life. As the sun began to set, we sat on the porch, drinking iced tea and admiring the colours of the sunset. At that moment, I felt a connection with Javier that I couldn't explain, a sense of comfort and mutual understanding. Looking back, I can see that this was the moment when things began to change between us. What had started as a simple friendship between a daughter-in-law and her father-in-law was slowly transforming into something deeper and more complicated. At the time, however, I was too blind to see it, too absorbed in the warmth and attention Javier was offering me. I realized now that I was walking a dangerous line, one that threatened to destroy everything I had built with Mark. But at the time, engulfed in my own loneliness and need for connection, I was unable or unwilling to see the warning signs. Instead, I allowed myself to be swept along by the current of emotions, unaware that I was heading into troubled waters that would soon threaten to drown me. The day Mark went into town to do some shopping, Javier and I found ourselves alone in the house. It was a hot summer day, and the air was charged with a tension that had been building between us for weeks, maybe even months. I decided to make fresh lemonade to combat the heat. As I squeezed the lemons, I could feel Javier's gaze on me. It was a look I had begun to notice more and more, one that made me feel both uncomfortable and excited. I tried to ignore it, concentrating on the task at hand. When I finished, I offered him a glass. Our fingers brushed as he took it, sending an electric current through my body. We sat at the kitchen table, drinking in silence, but the air between us was thick with unspoken words and repressed desires. Finally, Javier broke the silence. "Paula, there's something I've wanted to tell you for a long time," he began, his voice low and husky. "I know this is wrong, but I can't keep pretending I don't feel anything for you." His words surprised me, though deep down I think I had always known that. I had seen the way he looked at me, had felt the electricity between us. But hearing him say it out loud made it real in a way I couldn't ignore. "Javier, I don't know what to say," I stammered, my heart pounding in my chest. "This isn't right. I'm married to your son." "I know," he said, leaning closer to me. "But I can't help how I feel. When I'm with you, I feel alive in a way I haven't felt in years. You understand me, Paula, in a way that no one else does." Her words resonated with me, touching a part of my heart that I had been trying to ignore, because the truth was, I had feelings for Javier too. He made me feel seen, appreciated, in a way that Mark hadn't in a long time. Before I could stop myself, before I could think of the consequences, I found myself leaning into him. Our lips met in a kiss that was both gentle and urgent, full of longing and repressed desire. In that moment, everything else disappeared. I forgot that I was married, forgot that this man was my husband's father. All I could think about was the feel of his lips on mine, his hands caressing my skin, the fire burning inside me. We lost ourselves in the moment, in the passion that had been growing between us all this time. We made love right there on the kitchen table, with a desperation and a need I had never felt before. Then, as we lay together, trying to catch our breath, the reality of what we had done began to set in. I had betrayed my husband. I had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. But looking at Javier, seeing the love and tenderness in his eyes, I could not fully regret it. That day marked a turning point in our lives. We knew what we were doing was wrong, but we could not deny the feelings that had blossomed between us. From that moment on, we embarked on a secret romance, stealing moments together whenever we could, living for the brief moments of happiness that our forbidden love brought us. But even then, in the back of my mind, I knew this couldn't last. I knew we were playing with fire, and that in the end, someone would get burned. What I didn't know was how high a price we would have to pay for our brief moment of passion. Over the next few months, Javier and I immersed ourselves in our secret romance. We took every opportunity to be together, every stolen moment when Mark was busy in the fields or had left the farm. We would meet in the barn, in the cornfields, anywhere we could have a moment of intimacy. Whenever we were together, the outside world disappeared. It was just the two of us, lost in our love, in the connection we had forged. I remember one day in particular. Mark had gone into town for a meeting with other farmers in the area. Javier and I took the opportunity to have a picnic in the meadow behind the house. We spread a blanket under a large oak tree, and lay down, enjoying the food I had prepared and each other's company. As we lay there, Javier's head in my lap, I felt happier than I had in a long time. With him, I could be completely myself. I didn't have to pretend or pretend. I didn't have to hide parts of me. It was a heady feeling. I wish we could stay here forever, I whispered, stroking his hair. Just you and me, no worries, no need to hide. Javier sighed. I know, love. I'd give anything to be able to be with you like this all the time, to not have to steal these moments. But we both knew that was impossible. I was still married to Mark, and Javier was his father. What we were doing was not only morally questionable, but also had the potential to destroy our family if it was ever discovered. Despite this, we couldn't stop seeing each other. It was as if a magnetic force was drawing us to each other, a force more powerful than our reason or our judgment. Every time we tried to put an end to things, we ended up turning to each other, unable to resist the pull. But even in the midst of our happiness, guilt was always present. Every time I looked at Mark, every time he kissed me or touched me, I felt a pang of remorse. I was betraying my husband, the man I had promised to spend the rest of my life with. I tried to rationalize what I was doing. I told myself that Mark had been distant, that he wasn't paying attention to me like he used to. I convinced myself that what Javier and I had was special, that it was a once-in-a-lifetime love. But deep down, I knew these were just excuses. The truth was that I had allowed my own selfish desires to come before my commitment to my marriage. I had been weak. I had succumbed to temptation without thinking of the consequences. And those consequences, as I would soon discover, would be more serious than I could ever have imagined. Because despite our caution, despite all our efforts to keep our affair a secret, the truth had a way of coming out. And when it did, it threatened to destroy not only my marriage, but the entire life I had built. The day our secret was discovered began like any other. Mark had left early to supervise the repair of a fence on the north end of the property, and Javier and I had taken the opportunity to meet in the barn. We were so absorbed in each other, so lost in our own world, that we didn't hear the approaching footsteps until it was too late. The barn door burst open, and there, standing in the doorway, was Peter, one of the farm workers. The expression on his face went from surprise to shock, and then to disgust in a matter of seconds. Doña Paula, Don Javier, what's going on here? I pulled away from Javier as if his touch burned, my heart pounding in my chest. Peter, this is not what it looks like. But even as I said the words, I knew how weak and implausible they sounded. Peter had seen us in a passionate embrace, our bodies entwined in a way that left no doubt about the nature of our relationship. I can't believe this, Peter said, shaking his head. Don Mark trusts you, and this is how you repay him, by betraying him in his own home. Javier stepped forward, his hands raised in a conciliatory gesture. Peter, please. I know this looks bad, but if you could give us a chance to explain. But Peter was in no mood to listen. There's nothing to explain, he spat. What they're doing is wrong, period. And Don Mark deserves to know. With that, he turned and walked out of the barn, leaving Javier and me staring at each other in horror, knowing that our world was about to fall apart. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions. Peter, true to his word, confronted Javier and told him he had to tell Mark about what he had seen. Javier, consumed with guilt and remorse, agreed. I remember the night it all came out. Mark had returned from the fields, and we were sitting down to dinner when Javier asked to speak privately. I stood in the kitchen, wringing my hands anxiously, my stomach in knots. It wasn't long before I heard the screams. Mark's voice, normally so calm and gentle, was raised with anger and pain. How could you do this to me? I heard him scream. My own wife, with my own father. Then came the sound of angry footsteps, and Mark burst into the kitchen. His face was red with anger, his eyes bright with unshed tears. He looked at me, and I saw in his expression a mixture of betrayal, disgust, and a pain so raw that it took my breath away. "Mark," I began, tears running down my own cheeks. "I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt you." But he wouldn't listen to my apology. "How could you?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "How could you do this to me? To our marriage?" I had no answers, at least no answers that could ease his pain or justify what I had done. All I could do was cry and beg his forgiveness, knowing all the while that I had done something unforgivable. That night, as Mark packed his things and prepared to leave the farm, I knew our marriage was over. The trust we had built, the love we had shared, had been destroyed by my betrayal, and although a part of me longed for Javier, I knew our romance could never survive the public scrutiny, the trial and condemnation we would surely face. As I watched Mark drive away in his truck, his silhouette disappearing into the night, I felt as if a part of me was dying. I had lost my husband, I had lost my life, and all for a moment of passion, an instant of weakness that would now haunt me forever. In the days following Mark's departure, the farm was thrown into a state of chaos and confusion. The workers, who had been loyal to our family for years, now looked at me with a mixture of pity and disdain. I could hear their whispers when they thought I wasn't listening, their speculations about the nature of my relationship with Javier. Javier, for his part, was consumed with guilt. He would spend hours sitting on the porch, staring out at the horizon with vacant eyes. When we spoke, it was with strained formality, both of us aware of the gulf that now opened between us. "We have to end this," he said to me one day, his voice tired and defeated. "What we did was wrong, Paula. We can't go on, not at the expense of Mark's happiness." I knew she was right, but that didn't make it hurt any less. Despite the circumstances, despite the guilt and shame, my feelings for Javier hadn't changed. I still loved him, still craved his touch, his presence. But I also loved Mark. He had been my partner, my best friend, for so many years. The thought of losing him forever, of facing life without him by my side, was almost unbearable. In the weeks that followed, I tried desperately to get in touch with Mark. I left him countless messages, begging him to come home, promising him that we could work things out. But my pleas fell on deaf ears. Mark was gone, and with each passing day, I realised he might never return. Meanwhile, the guilt ate away at me. I began to neglect my chores on the farm, spending hours in bed, crying until I ran out of tears. Javier tried to comfort me, but his presence only served as a painful reminder of what we had done, of the pain we had caused. It was during this time that the rumours began. At first, they were just whispers, sidelong glances and murmurs behind raised hands. But soon, they became something more insidious. "I heard she planned all this from the beginning," I overheard a woman say in the village market. "She married Mark just to get closer to her father. I always knew there was something fishy about her," another replied. "Poor Mark. He deserves so much better than that." I couldn't hear the rest. I ran out of the market, tears burning in my eyes, my heart pounding in my chest. Was this what everyone thought of me? That I was some kind of opportunist? A home wrecker? But as the days turned into weeks, I realised I couldn't escape the whispers, the accusing stares. My transgression, my betrayal, had become the talk of the town. I was no longer Paula, Mark's wife, Javier's daughter-in-law. Now I was Paula, the adulteress, the woman who had broken her sacred marriage vow. And although a part of me wanted to scream, wanted to defend my love for Javier, I knew it was useless. Because in the end, regardless of my feelings, what I had done was wrong. I had betrayed my husband, I had destroyed my marriage. And now I had to face the consequences of my actions, painful as they were. The news of the divorce arrived in a nondescript white envelope, delivered by a messenger on a grey, rainy morning. Even though I had been expecting this, even though I knew in my heart that it was inevitable, seeing the words there, in cold legal language, made it all seem even more real and final. Mark was filing for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. But I knew the truth. I knew it was my infidelity, my betrayal that had led to this point. I signed the papers with trembling hands, tears running down my cheeks and falling onto the paper, smudging the ink. It was official now. My marriage was over, destroyed by my own selfish actions. In the days that followed, I drifted in a kind of fog. I felt numb, disconnected from everything and everyone around me. Javier tried to comfort me, but I pushed him away. Being near him was too painful, a constant reminder of what we had done and what we had lost. I heard from one of the workers that Mark had decided to sell his share of the farm. I wanted nothing to do with the place, with the memories it held. The news hit me hard. This farm had been Mark's dream, the legacy he had hoped to build and eventually pass on to our children. And now, because of me, I was giving it all up. As the weeks passed, I began to realize that I couldn't stay on the farm. Every corner, every beam and board was steeped in memories. Memories of my life with Mark, of our happiness before he ruined everything. And then there were the memories of Javier, of our clandestine encounters, of the forbidden passion that had consumed us. It was too much to bear. So I began to pack my things, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency. I didn't know where I would go, what I would do. All I knew was that I needed to escape. I needed to get away from the constant reminder of my mistakes and my losses. The night before I left, Javier came to see me. He had aged over the past few months, the weight of our guilt and our pain etched in the lines of his face. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "You could stay. We could try." But I shook my head, tears filling my eyes. "We can't, Javier. What we had, it was a mistake. A beautiful, passionate mistake, but a mistake nonetheless. I need to leave. I need to find a way to live with what we've done." He didn't argue, perhaps recognizing the truth in my words. He hugged me then, tightly and desperately, as if he could keep me safe from all the pain and regret we carried inside. And for a moment, I allowed myself to lose myself in his embrace, one last time. But we both knew this was the end. Our love, as powerful and consuming as it had been, could not survive in the light of what we had done. It was tainted now, poisoned by guilt and betrayal. So I turned away, wiping away my tears. And with a final goodbye, a last look at the life I had so utterly destroyed, I left, toward a future that was uncertain, but that I hoped might bring, if not happiness, at least some peace. It's been almost a year since I left the farm, since my life crumbled into a million irreparable pieces. It's been a year of introspection, grief, and, slowly, acceptance. After I left, I travelled aimlessly for a while. I took odd jobs where I could find them. Waitress at a roadside diner, receptionist at a cheap hotel. I never stayed in one place for long, always moving, always looking for something. Maybe I was looking for a way to escape my memories, my guilt. Or maybe I was simply looking for a place where I could start over, where I could be someone other than the woman who had betrayed her husband to her father-in-law. It was during this time that I finally heard from Mark. He contacted me through his lawyer to discuss the final details of the divorce, the division of assets, the agreement on the sale of the farm. His messages were short, professional, completely devoid of any personal emotion. It was as if he was communicating with a stranger, not the woman he had shared his life with for years. And maybe that's what she was to him now. A stranger. The woman he had loved, the woman he had married, had ceased to exist the moment I had given into my passion for her father. Now, I was simply someone I had once known, someone who had done her irreparable harm. With Javier, things were just as tense. We spoke on the phone a few times. Short, painful conversations filled with awkward silences. We had loved each other, yes, but we had also destroyed so many lives in the process, including our own. How is one supposed to move on after something like that? Eventually, I found my way back to my hometown. I moved into a small apartment, got a job at a local bookstore. Little by little, day by day, I began to rebuild my life. It was not easy. There were days when the weight of my guilt was almost too much to bear. Days when I wanted to just give up, to let myself be consumed by my pain and regrets. But somehow, I kept going. Because I knew I had to. I knew I owed it to Mark, to Javier, and to myself. Now, as I look back over the past year, I realise that while I have lost much, I have also gained something invaluable. A deeper understanding of myself, of my strengths and my weaknesses, of my capacity to love and to hurt. I don't know what the future holds. There is still a lot of pain, a lot of healing ahead, but for the first time in a long time, I feel a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, I can find a way to forgive myself and move on. Because in the end, that's all any of us can do. Move forward, one day at a time, in the hope that the future will bring with it the promise of new beginnings and second chances. And maybe, in time, I can find a way to make peace with my past and fully embrace the present. Because yes, I have made mistakes, mistakes that will haunt me for the rest of my life. But I also know that I am more than my mistakes, more than my failures. I am a survivor, a fighter, and no matter what life throws at me, I know I will find the strength to face it. One step at a time, one day at a time, I will keep going. Because that's what we do. That's what I must do. For Mark, for Javier, but most of all, for myself. Because in the end, only I can write the rest of my story. And I am determined to make it a story of redemption, hope, and self-love.